Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 7. We finally get to talk about bones. Most of us, when we started to take anatomy, we probably didn't think it was going to have this much chemistry, enzyme action, talking about, cellular respiration. We thought bones, muscles, nerves were good. So we're finally getting to kind of the hands-on part that students seem to like a lot. To start, we need to talk about the components of the skeletal system. So we know first we have bones, and this is going to be the primary organ of the skeletal system. But we do have cartilage, right? Connective tissue that is avascular. Then we have ligaments, and remember, ligaments are how bone is attached to bone. Remember, it's the collagen fibers in that parallel line structure, right? So it's that dense, regular connective tissue. And then we're going to talk about other connective tissue types that we're going to see in the skeletal system. And you might see tendons, and we're going to see joint cavities, so some other types of tissue that we'll revisit. As far as the bones, I said they're the primary organ, but remember they also make up the framework of the body. We're going to talk more about these multiple functions as we move through the slides. Two types of bone that we have to look at. The first is compact bone. This makes up the majority of our bone, and it is really dense. So you're going to see kind of these outer sections that are really thick, and we call this compact bone. And we'll look at the structures and how we know compact versus spongy. So the second type of bone is spongy bone. It appears porous. It looks like it has little holes in it, and this is about 20%. And it's usually internal to the compact bone. So internal, you're going to have spongy bone. And this helps make our bones strong, but light. So if we were complete compact bone, it'd be really hard to break a bone, but we'd have to have giant muscles to move these completely compact bones around. We also have to mention cartilage. So cartilage is connective tissue that's more flexible than bone. If you remember these types, hyaline cartilage, so this is attached to ribs and sternum, covers the end of some bones, growth plates, and a model for bone formation. We'll talk more about bone formation in subsequent slides. We'll talk about endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification, but I don't want to go there yet. So hyaline cartilage, think about anywhere that you have two bones that are connected to each other, you're going to have hyaline cartilage. So whenever you see an articulation, two bones joined together, you're going to have some sort of cartilage there to act as a buffer. We're also going to see fibrocartilage. So this is more of a compression resistance, if you remember. So the pubic symphysis, the fibrocartilage that allows for the hips to move, right? And when they come back together, they're not smacking each other. The intervertebral discs, so as your back spreads out and comes down, every time you step, you have an expansion and a contraction. You've got those intervertebral discs, right? Spinal discs. And then the meniscus of the knee. So think of hyaline cartilage as kind of abrasion resistant. It allows bones to move past each other. So think of the rib cage and the sternum you're going to have during inspiration. You're going to take a really deep breath and everything's going to kind of spread out and elevate. And then when you exhale, it's all going to come back together. So hyaline cartilage protects the end of the bone. We don't want bone on bone. Fibrocartilage, more compression related. So areas where you have a lot of force coming down. So the meniscus between your femur and your tibia, your pubic symphysis when your two hip bones or os coxa come together, and then when your vertebrae are moving, expanding and contracting a little bit, their intervertebral discs are there to help. Remember, we also have ligaments and we also have tendons. So ligaments, bone to bone, tendons, bones to muscles. I always said Mr. T, right? Mr. T had lots of muscles. A lot of people, I got to find somebody new. I don't know, Vin Diesel, I don't know, Dwayne Johnson. It just doesn't work as well, right? So I got to find something that starts with a T that we can relate to lots of muscles. Nice image here talking about the items that I just mentioned on the previous slide. So you can see hyaline cartilage is here in blue. You can kind of see anytime we have bones coming together, you're going to have hyaline cartilage. And then they specifically name certain sections. So this is called costal cartilage. Articular cartilage is at the ends where we see articulation. So articulation means to join, right? So this would be an articulated skeleton. If I had just a bone laying on the table, this would be disarticulated. Then it might be hard to see the red, but this darker color is supposed to be showing you the location of the fibrocartilage. So here, meniscus, here in the back, the intervertebral discs, and then here, the pubic symphysis. So I'd make sure that I understand the different types of cartilage and then what or where you would find those cartilages in the body. Here we have a list of the general functions of bones. Most of us get support and protection, right? They give us our framework. They support our body. The protection part, think of all of the organs that are encased in bone. So we have the brain, we have the spinal cord, we have the heart and the lungs. So we should get the protection part. The levers for movement may not make sense until we get to the muscle chapter, Unit 4, but you have bones and then you have muscles that are attached. And these muscles are going to contract and get smaller, and when they do, it allows for movement. We're contracting the muscle, it pulls on the bone, and it allows us to move. We have hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Anytime you see this hemo or hema, think blood. So we have the ability to produce more blood cells because of this red bone marrow. So basically in our red bone marrow, we have the stem cells necessary to repopulate blood cells. We won't talk about that too much until we get to later chapters in the second half of anatomy. We'll talk about blood and white blood cells and red blood cells and all of the cells that we need or that are found in our blood. This one is probably the one that we haven't heard of that is important. Most people, we know that our bones are made up of calcium, but we don't think of our bones as storing calcium and then releasing calcium as needed. So the bones act as a storage. So we have calcium and phosphate, and if you remember from other lectures, I said calcium is important for all muscle action. So all action, muscles, nerves, clotting. So you have to have calcium in order for all of these events to occur. So it's pretty important. It would make sense that we could store extra calcium inside our bones so that if we needed calcium really quickly, we could break down some bone and release calcium. Now, just some bone. I'm not talking about breaking down an entire bone, right? Just some of it to get some of that calcium reserve out. Also, the energy reserve here they're talking about is adipose. So we also, in addition to red marrow, we have yellow marrow. And yellow marrow, adipose tissue that we can use as an energy reserve if we don't have food. Here's the classification of bones determined by shape, and you can see that we have 4 classes here. Long bones are great in length compared to width. So you're going to have kind of this column-shaped bone. Think of the femur, the humerus, tibia, fibula. Short bones are going to have equal width and length, and I wish they didn't call them short. I wish they called them cube-shaped. That'd be great. Carpals and tarsals. So carpals are wrist bones, right? And tarsals are ankle bones. So they're kind of these cube-shaped bones, and some might be a little irregular and have, different kind of structures, but overall, they're more of a cube-shaped. Do not think that finger bones, phalanx, phalanges, they are not short bones. So if you see a finger phalange and it looks like this, even though it's really small, it's a long bone because it is longer than it is wide. Flat bones, pretty self-explanatory, right? Flat, thin, might be slightly curved. Some of these cranial bones that we'll look at, like the frontal, parietal, occipital, they do have some bumps to them and they might be curve shaped, but overall they're flat in structure. And then we have this catch-all, right? Irregular bones. They're going to be elaborate and have these complex shapes, and you'll see this when we look at vertebrae or oscoxia, hip bones. Just an image form of everything we just talked about. Here's a flat bone. Even though it's curved, if you held one in your hand, it is very thin and flat. Obviously, here's an irregular vertebrae. Your hip, your os coxa, I also said was an irregular bone. Then we can see the long bone here, the femur. It is longer than it is wide. And then here are those cube-shaped short bones, and you also have those in the wrist. What I wanted you to look at are the phalanx or finger bones. They are actually long bones. So they are actually longer than they are wide. The next few slides have lots of terminology, so I'm going to quickly run through the terminology, and then I think it's best if we just look at the figure from the textbook. So we have the diaphysis. So this is the cylindrical shaft, compact bone where you're going to see tiny little bits of spongy bone extending inward. Then we have the medullary cavity. This is going to be the hollow space, and it can either have red marrow or yellow marrow, depending if it's in a child or in an adult. So real quick, just do a little critical thinking right here. If you're a child, you probably have more red marrow, right? Because we said these are stem cells that are going to produce more blood cells. And when you're a child, you have to grow, right? So you're going to have to produce more blood cells. So it would make sense that a child would have more red marrow than an adult. Once you're an adult, you've finished growing. What's more important to have? That kind of energy reserve backup, right? We have more yellow marrow when we're adults. We have another section called the epiphysis. This is going to be kind of the knobby regions. So the top and the bottom are going to be the epiphysis, and this is the diaphysis, right? The middle part. Now we have proximal and distal ends. So it depends on farthest away from the trunk, right? Or closest to the trunk. So we might want to know whether we have a fracture in the proximal epiphysis or in the distal epiphysis. They want to make sure you understand that at the epiphyseal ends, you are going to have articular cartilage. What is articular cartilage? It's where two bones come together, where they join or where we have a joint, and they're made up of hyaline cartilage. So if you see articular cartilage, you should be thinking kind of the tissue that surrounds the epiphyseal end of a bone. This would be another bone. And this would be the articular cartilage. So you're always going to have hyaline cartilage on the outside of two bones that join together to reduce friction and absorb shock in these movable joints. We have this metaphysis, or we have an epiphyseal plate. So a metaphysis is a region of bone between the diaphysis and the epiphysis that's mature. An epiphyseal plate is a growth plate. It's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. This is where bone growth can occur. In adults, it becomes the epiphyseal line. So if you see the word epiphyseal plate, you should think child. If you see epiphyseal line, you should think adult. Let's take all the words that we just learned and see if we can point them out on this image. So we know we have a diaphysis. A diaphysis is the shaft part, right? So this part of the bone is the diaphysis. The ends are called epiphyseal ends, right? And we have either a proximal epiphysis or we have a distal epiphysis. Remember that they're covered in hyaline cartilage, and that particularly is called articular cartilage. It's made up of hyaline cartilage, but it helps with articulation, right? So we have articular cartilage, we have a proximal epiphyseal end, we have a distal epiphyseal end, we have the diaphysis, and then we talked about metaphysis. So the metaphysis is the area between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So we could look at it down here, right? So this is where the diaphysis is, this is where the epiphysis is. So if I draw a line separating those two, then this has to be the meta. And what's in the meta? The meta, you can have an epiphyseal line, and you can see here that that's a line. It's a pretty heavy white line. But it could also be the epiphyseal plate, which is the growth plate. So one of the things to think about is if I showed you this bone and I said, is this an adult or a child? You could look at that line and you could say, oh, well, it's a solid line. It's not cartilage. Then it has to be an adult. If you saw a bunch of cartilage in here, then you would say, okay, that has to be a child because that's a growth plate. I think the other term that we mentioned was the medullary cavity. So you can see that the diaphysis is hollowed out in long bones, and it has this cavity that forms. And it usually contains yellow marrow if we're talking about adults. Coverings and linings of the bone. So we have this word periosteum. So peri means around, and osteum means bone. So this is a covering on the outer surface of the bone. It's going to protect the bone from other structures surrounding it. It's going to provide an anchor for blood vessels and nerves to get to the bone surface, and it's going to be an attachment for ligaments and tendons. It's made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. So that should tell you something as well. That should tell you lots of collagen, irregular, good at flexibility, right? There's an inner cellular layer, and it's going to have osteoprogenitor cells. We used to call these osteogenic cells. And then we have osteoblasts, which build bone, and we have osteoclasts, which cut bone or break bone down. This figure shows you the compact bone. Remember, the compact bone would be here on the outside, and then in here you would have spongy bone. So outside or superficial to the compact bone, we're going to have this periosteum. And the periosteum has cells. Those cells can make bone or break bone. We have perforating fibers. These little fibers actually allow the periosteum to stay in contact with the bone, so there's no slippage. Then we have a fibrous layer, and all of this makes up the periosteum. Inside the bone, we're going to see this term osteocyte. So this is a bone cell. Not only do we have an outer connective tissue layer to bones, but we also have an inner. So endosteum. This is going to be, right, internal bone lining. So this covers the internal surface of the bone within the medullary cavity. It also contains cells, so it's going to have these stem cells, if you will, osteoprogenitor cells. It's going to have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Here's a nice image of endosteum. We see the spongy bone here, and we see this nice layer lining the medullary cavity. It's going to have osteoblasts, osteoprogenitor cells. You're going to see osteoclasts, and then outside of the endosteum, we see osteocytes again. So kind of putting in a mental picture here, if I had my compact bone, what is this lining on the outside? It is periosteum. And then I'm going to have spongy bone here, right? So spongy bone. And then what's inside? Here I'm going to have my medullary cavity. What kind of lining do I have right here? I have endosteum. So it might be good for you to start from the outside and make sure that you know which structures as you're moving to the inside. So periosteum first, then compact bone, then spongy bone, then endosteum, then you finally get to the medullary cavity. So something I want you to think about is we have all of these cells. So I'm going to do them a different color here. Let's see. So we have cells here in the endosteum, and we have cells out here in the periosteum. So we have the ability to build bone. We also have the ability to break bone down on both sides. So the compact and the spongy bone are internal to the endosteum and the periosteum, and both of those linings have cells that have the ability to build bone or to break bone down. Previously, we've been looking at a long bone. We haven't looked at short, flat, or irregular bones yet. They're a little bit different than a long bone. They're going to have no medullary cavity, and they're going to have this diplo, this structure that you only see in short, flat, and irregular bones. Nice example here of a flat bone with this diplo structure or diplo structure. It has compact bone, and then it has spongy, and then it has compact. To me, it's kind of like a sandwich structure. Think about areas where we have flat bones, especially the skull, and you'll see that this structure makes sense. It's not just one layer of compact. So if somebody were to hit you over the head, we have to get through one compact layer, then we have to get through the spongy layer, then we have to get to another compact layer before we get to the meninges or the linings around your brain. So it kind of offers more compression resistance. Hopefully you remember from histology that bones are vascular, and here they say highly vascular. There's lots of blood going to your bones. We have to have some way to get those arteries and veins through the bone, and so those are called nutrient foramen. We also have nerves, right? Bones are highly innervated. This is why it hurts when you break a bone. So they come with the blood vessels through the nutrient foramen. They're going to innervate the bone, the periosteum, the endosteum, and the marrow cavity. A little bit more about bone marrow. We know we have red bone marrow that helps form blood cells. In children, this is going to be in all long bones. So in the spongy bone and the medullary cavity of all long bones. In adults, we don't need as much, and you're only going to find it in select areas. So the skull will still have it, vertebrae, ribs, sternum, parts of your humerus and your femur, the proximal epiphyseal end, the end that's closest to your trunk. Yellow marrow is a product of red bone marrow that degenerates. It becomes this fatty substance. It can be turned back to red bone marrow in extreme situations. So they list those there, but this is not a normal event. You can see from this image what we mean by axial skeleton. So this is red bone marrow, and this is in an adult, and you can see it's here in the skull, just the top part or proximal epiphyseal end, just the proximal epiphyseal end, and back up. So remember, this is appendicular, and then the core there is axial skeleton. Now we get to talk about those cells that I kept mentioning. So bone, connective tissue, is the primary component of bone. Bone is composed of cells and extracellular matrix. So remember, if we have a cell, it can create proteins, and it can ship those proteins outside of the cell. So you could have proteins just floating out here in the extracellular environment. And then you could have another cell over here, and it could also be making proteins, right? And those proteins are floating out here in the extracellular matrix. So we have osteoprogenitor cells. If I slip up and say osteogenic, same thing. We have osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. These are basically stem cells, these osteoprogenitor cells. They're going to divide, and they're going to create another stem cell, and then a cell that's committed to become an osteoblast. And we have these, remember from the previous slides, we have cells located in both of the linings, the periosteum and the endosteum. So what we're saying is this osteoprogenitor cell is going to, at one cell, it's going to divide. This becomes the new stem cell, and this one is going to be committed to become an osteoblast. And this is how stem cells work. We're going to see this same pattern again when we talk about the immune system in 202, when we talk about reproductive cells. If you have a stem cell, it will always copy itself, and one of them will go back as the reserve, and one will go forward as the committed cell. Osteoblasts form from the osteoprogenitor cells, and they start secreting a matrix. They start secreting something called osteoid. So it's organic, it's going to be pushed outside of the cell, and it's going to become calcified. So basically an osteoblast's job is to make this osteoid substance, this matrix, and excrete it outside of the cell. When it hardens, we have an osteocyte. This is a mature bone cell. So start with the osteoprogenitor cell. Does what? It creates an osteoblast. What does the osteoblast do? It makes matrix and pushes it outside of the cell. And then what happens to that matrix? The matrix hardens, And when the matrix hardens, when the osteoblast is completely surrounded by hard matrix, we call this an osteocyte. It's a bone cell. It is mature. Osteoclasts are able to break bone, or if you want to think cut bone, either way. So osteoclasts are derived from bone marrow cells. They're multinuclear. That means they have lots of nuclei. The cell never split into separate cells when it was dividing. It just became this really large cell. And it has this phagocytosis ability, right? The ability to engulf and break down and digest particles. So I'll show you the image in just a second, but this is involved in bone reabsorption. So if I needed to break down bone on a specific area, the osteoclast would be responsible for that. And then your osteoblasts would build bone. Nice flow chart here. We see the osteoprogenitor cell that gives rise to the osteoblast. Then the osteoblast is going to secrete matrix, and then that matrix is going to harden. And when that matrix hardens around the osteoblast completely, we now call it a mature bone cell, which is an osteocyte. This image, you can see the osteoclast. You can see that it's a really large group of cells, fused cells. You can see all the nuclei here, and you can see that the surface area of the osteoclast comes into contact with quite a lot of bone, so it can break down bone pretty easily with the digestive enzymes that are inside the osteoclast. So within the bone matrix, we have organic and inorganic components. So bone is made up of both organic, which I think of as living, and I think of the cells that we talked about, those osteoprogenitor, right, osteoblasts. For the inorganic part, I think of non-living, and I'm usually thinking of some sort of mineral or metal, right? So let's focus on the organic first, and then we'll look at inorganic in the next couple of slides. So the organic components, remember the osteoblasts are going to make osteoids. We kept calling this matrix, right? So the osteoblasts are going to produce proteins and sugars, and they're going to excrete it outside of the osteoblast, that is the matrix, but the little kind of packages, the little vesicles, are called osteoids. And so what's going to happen to this matrix, these osteoids, is they're going to get hardened eventually, right? But what is the material? What's inside the osteoid? Well, there's collagen, so that should be telling you flexibility, right? There's also some ground substance, and there's some proteoglycans and some glycoproteins. Both of these things are proteins plus sugars. This is kind of complex, and these are a little bit more simple, but they're the same. It's proteins and sugars coming together. So the osteoblast makes an osteoid, and that osteoid consists of collagen and then these protein sugars. This is going to help give bones strength, but also flexibility. Now we have the inorganic parts. So here, calcium, phosphate. When it forms crystals, we call this hydroxyapatite. Other substances, we can have calcium carbonate, we can have sodium, magnesium. So again, these are all minerals, right, of some sort. Crystals deposit around the collagen fibers. So that's what's actually hardening the matrix. So that term you should know, hydroxyapatite, which is basically calcium phosphate crystals, right? And that's what hardens the osteoids. And what are osteoids made up of? Collagen fibers and glycoproteins. Sorry, couldn't think of the word. This gives the bones their stability. When I say rigidity, some people think negatively about that term. So to me, it's the hardness of bones. So something to think about is that this is a great structure, right? We have the flexibility that the collagen provides, but then we also have the stability or the strength that the calcium phosphate crystals provide. So this is a pretty intricate structure that we usually take for granted, right? We've gone through bone formation quite a bit throughout the PowerPoint. They're just kind of summarizing it here. So begins with the secretion of an osteoid, but where is that coming from? So remember, osteoids are secreted from osteoblast cells. Then you're going to have a calcification. That hydroxyapatite crystals are going to form around the collagen. And you're going to go from an osteoblast to an osteocyte, which is a mature bone cell once all of the calcification has occurred. This does require some vitamins. So we need vitamin D and vitamin C. So vitamin C is necessary for the collagen formation, and vitamin D enhances the calcium reabsorption from our stomach and our small intestine so that we can actually use it to create the hydroxyapatite. So sometimes we need to do bone reabsorption. Sometimes we need to break down or destroy the matrix, and the cells that are going to do this are the osteoclasts. They have digestive enzymes inside of the lysosomes, which are inside of the osteoclasts. Remember, these are organelles that we've talked about before. And they're going to break down the organic matrix components, and they're going to release the calcium phosphate. And where is it going to go? It's going to enter the blood. So if blood calcium levels are low, we're going to break down bone and we're going to enter that calcium into our bloodstream so that we can have the calcium we need for muscle contraction or nervous cell transmission or clotting or some other event. So it's kind of like your body is saying, I'd rather break down a little bit of bone and have that calcium for these much needed homeostasis actions, right? We have to have muscle contraction. Our heart has to beat, right? We have to be able to think. We have to be able to control our breathing. So those are more important than breaking down a little bit of bone here and there. So kind of big picture I just wanted to talk about is that bone is constantly being remodeled. You're constantly building and breaking down. So you have osteoblasts working, and you also have osteoclasts working. When there's a disruption between the two, that's when we have issues. So you can have excessive bone reabsorption. What happens if you just keep breaking down bone and breaking down bone, right? Your bones will break more easily. You could slip and fall and break a hip, right? You won't be able to support your weight as well. So larger osteoclasts can start breaking down bone at higher rates than they need to. And one of the things that you might want to think about is it easier to build a house or to tear one down? So most of us, these guys work pretty fast. If I wanted to break down a house, I could bring in a bulldozer and it could be down in an hour. If I needed to build a house, it's going to take 6 months to a year. So osteoblasts usually work a lot slower than osteoclasts. So if all of a sudden your osteoclasts are in overdrive, it's going to be really hard for you to keep up by building more bone. So you need to know a little bit about the microscopic anatomy of compact bone. So what makes compact bone compact? What gives it strength? So there are these small cylindrical structures called osteons, and they're the structural unit of mature bone. And it almost looks like a bullseye or a target, or some people said tree rings, right? You're going to have a central canal, and this is where all the blood vessels and nerves are going to extend through the bone. You have concentric lamella. When you see lamella, I want you to think layers. So concentric layers of bone that you're going to see surrounding the central canal, and these contain collagen fibers. Remember, bone is mostly collagen fibers that have been hardened by matrix, right? Also, this term osteocyte, we've mentioned it already, but it's mature bone. You're going to find it between concentric lamella. You're going to see something called lacuna, which is a lake. That's what that term means. And canaliculi. These are tiny interconnecting channels. So you're going to see these extend from each lacuna, travel through the lamella, and connect to another lacuna in a central canal. It allows the exchange of nutrients and minerals and gases between the blood vessels and the osteocytes. This image makes things a little bit easier, although I wish it was a little bit larger here. But you can see this entire structure is an osteon. And at the core is the central canal. And inside the central canal, you're going to have veins and arteries and nerves. You can see the black dots. The black dots are osteocytes. They're osteocytes that have been trapped in hardened bone. What do we call that? Concentric lamella. So these rings are basically hardened matrix. What are the black dots? All the black dots are osteocytes. Osteocytes get trapped by the hardened matrix, and it's almost like they look glassy in appearance when you look at them. They shimmer like a lake, which is why they call them lacuna. So it's an osteocyte trapped in these concentric lamella or hardened matrix, and they can talk to each other via these canaliculi, or these little channels, so they can exchange nutrients between layers. And of course, nothing can be easy, right? So besides osteons and central canals, we have perforating canals, we have circumferential lamella, which is different than the other lamella, concentric lamella, and then we have interstitial lamella. Another image for us, so here's our periosteum, and we have our perforating fibers attaching the periosteum to the bone. You can see the osteons, right? The osteons are the circles. You can see that there is an outer wrapping, which is the external circumferential lamella, and then we have an internal wrapping, which is the internal circumferential. So remember, circumferential, circumference, around. And then these were called concentric because they went around in circles. So I know it's going to be hard to kind of separate all these out. I like to think of this as if I took a whole bunch of pins, those are the osteons, and then I took a rubber band and wrapped it around the pins. So that's what this outer external circumferential lamella is. It's holding all of these individual tubes or osteons together. And then we have to have some sort of boundary between the compact bone and the spongy bone, and so we have this internal circumferential lamella. So I want you to notice the central canals here. Maybe I should use a different color. Central canal here, and then this is a perforating canal. So if it just, makes a right turn or a left turn, that's a perforating canal. So they're kind of offshoots from the central canal. Another thing I want you to notice here is these lines are supposed to represent collagen fibers. So remember that the osteocytes are in here, and the osteocytes are secreting matrix, and that matrix is hardened crystals onto the collagen fibers. But I also want you to pay attention to the way that the collagen fibers are oriented. So do you see how some collagen fibers in the first ring go this way, and then they go this way in the second ring? What do you think happens in the third ring? Does that seem like a structure that gives you more stability? Yes, you kind of have this crossing over of collagen fibers. So there's kind of more than meets the eye here to the component of compact bone. It's not just the hardening with the hydroxyapatite, but it's also the arrangement of the collagen fibers that gives us this strength. Another image here showing you the collagen fiber direction that's giving us stability, kind of driving home that we have osteocytes that are trapped in the concentric lamella. And then if we pulled out just one patch here, we could see that we have an osteocyte that's become trapped in bone, but they have these little extensions that come out, which are called canaliculi, and it allows one osteocyte to communicate with another, and that this part is still living, right? This osteocyte is still living, so they'll say it's trapped in a lacuna or a lake. It's surrounded by bone. Just like compact has a distinct structure called an osteon, spongy bone has a distinct structure called trabeculae or trabeculi, And it's probably best if we just go and look at the picture. It's really hard to explain. It's kind of like a crisscross of rods and bars. This is a little confusing for people, so let's go back out for a second, and we know that we have compact bone here. What's on the outside? We have our periosteum. Then inside of the compact bone, we're going to have spongy bone. And then what's lining the spongy bone? We have the endosteum, right? So what we're looking at is the spongy bone and the endosteum. So this is all endosteum sitting on top of spongy bone. How do I know it's spongy bone? Well, we have these pockets or these spaces that kind of look like holes. And then here's where the trabeculae come in. These bars, these kind of like cross bars that form in between the spaces or the holes. Those are the trabeculae. So what they're saying is if I came in here and I cut a piece off, if I took trabeculae and I cut it in half or did an oblique section, this is what you would see. You would see that we have osteoclasts, we have osteocytes, we have osteoblasts, and that everything is wrapped in endosteum, right? There is no periosteum, right? Periosteum is only on the outside of compact bone. But do we still have all of the cells that we need in order to have bone growth and development? Yes. We have to talk just a few slides about hyaline cartilage, but some of this may not make sense until we talk about bone formation and endochondral ossification or endochondral bone formation. Sometimes people don't use this word ossification. It's what I learned, so sometimes it's stuck in my head. But the starting material for long bone formation is hyaline cartilage. So they want to go through just a little bit about hyaline cartilage so that we understand kind of where bone starts and why we have to have hyaline cartilage and what's going to happen to turn the hyaline cartilage into bone when we're developing in utero. So hyaline cartilage, there's going to be some sort of matrix being produced. You're going to have ground substance that's flexible, high percentage of water, high compressibility, good shock absorber. But remember, cartilage is avascular. So if I'm turning hyaline cartilage into bone, I'm going to have to add blood vessels, right? Because bone is highly vascularized. So this might make a little bit more sense in part 2. They just want to go over some of the terminology because hyaline cartilage is closely associated with bone. Not only is hyaline cartilage the starting material for long bones, but remember we also have hyaline cartilage on both of the epiphyseal ends of our long bones, but we call it articular cartilage. Right? Some of the terminology is very similar to bones. So if I have hyaline cartilage, I'm going to have chondroblasts. These are going to be cells that produce cartilage matrix. I'm going to have chondriocytes. Once the blasts get encased with matrix, they're going to be called chondriocytes or mature cartilage cells. And then we also have a connective tissue that covers the cartilage and helps maintain its shape, and it's called perichondrium. We can see the list. It says the process of cartilage growth. This is going to begin embryologically. So as you're developing, you're going to take the cartilage and it's going to grow in length and in width and then start to be calcified or ossified and turned into bone. I would know these terms. So interstitial growth is growth in length and oppositional is width.